Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this panel on the ancient utopia in context, post-classical explorations of the perfect across and under the seas. My name is Hamish Williams and I'll be acting as the chair today. And I'm delighted to have 𝘧𝘰𝘮𝘯𝘥 as the discussant and also a panelist, as well as Ryan Denson and Aaron Bake as two other panelists. So the subject of today's discussion is indeed the ancient utopia. So ancient texts, as we know, provide many examples of paradises to be discovered across or below the seas, away from the European mainland, including Plato's Atlantis, the Blessed Isles across various writers, Crete, Minoan Crete, the Phaeacian island of Scheria, and Poseidon's underwater kingdom, many of which, moreover, enjoyed long classical afterlives in the modern era, from Thomas More at the start of the 1500s to Madeline Miller and other modern popular fiction writers in the last decade. Against conceptions of such ancient isolated paradises as retrospective, merely nostalgic longings for a mythic past, this panel explores and reinterprets this topos, both in classical texts, but also to some extent in modern receptions, by juxtaposing the production of utopian thought with contemporary ideas, contemporary in the ancient world and contemporary now, contemporary ideas of decolonization, space, time, change. In other words, that these utopias were relevant to what was happening in society and culture at that time. I think then we can go straight into the papers. So I would first like to introduce Aaron Bake. Aaron is a postdoctoral research fellow at Northwest University in South Africa. He received his PhD in 2015 from the University of Minnesota, and his principal research area is pirates, bandits, and other outlaws and outcasts in the ancient Mediterranean. His most recent publication is the article Augustine's Pirate, the Conception of King and Bandit in Greek and Roman Political Philosophy. So Aaron, I'll leave it over to you then to take us on your journey through your particular island utopia. Yep.
Thank you. In both the classical Mediterranean and modern colonial period, there's a motif of sailing away to find utopia. It strikes me that sailing to utopia combines three philosophical threads. First, it suggests the idea that there's a rich land, where the land produces food of its own accord, where the climate is pleasant, and people are free from strife and toil. What this bounty means there's no need to contest over it. Such we see in Pindar's pleasant afterlife in Olympian 2, or in Homer's Phaeacia in the Odyssey. Second, however, there's this different image, one in which men come together and design the perfect state. This state is stable, allows for generational change, free from corruption and petty politics. The citizens of such a state must work, but the work is not burdensome. The people of such utopians in ancient writings often are depicted with unusual customs to ensure this, such as the children of the sun in Iambulus, via Diodorus, eschewing marriage, living in groups no larger than 400, and being ruled by the oldest. Third, the ideal society is generally cast. Oh, you made me big. Okay. The ideal society is generally cast as far away in an isolated place where they don't have to interact with others. These images are not exclusive, of course, and interclassical utopia-like states are often combined. And while ancient writers like Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, Polybius, Cicero, and Augustine mused over the best way to structure a state, other writers like Herodotus, Diodorus, Strabo, Mela, and Pliny posited wondrous lands in far distant places. Similarly, colonial writings vary between the depiction of a pristine land ripe for new farms and settlements and a depiction of a meritocratic society free to implement better rules than the country left behind. And I think of this distinction, as you all know, as the distinction between finding utopia and founding utopia. Is the perfect land rooted in the disciplined customs of its people, or in an idyllic landscape that reduces strife? And handout 1, I think, here we go. Right. So in handout 1, I think captures this distinction perfectly. They say Athamas, when he was exiled from his homeland, found his daughter playing and piling up stone, the sort of stone they now have at Chios, and he asked her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "While you were seeking some place to found, that is, settle a city, I found, that is, discovered it. And moved by this, he named the city Teos, that is, someplace. I think it's wonderful because it has a pun in both languages. But it illustrates this distinction that you can find a perfect place or you can found a perfect place. And really different in how you intend to settle the colony that you're settling. And as we all know, colonial propaganda often portrayed unsettled land as unsettled, despite the fact that it already was settled. And this too has classical forebears. The so-called Greek colonization of the Western Mediterranean reveals these Greek settlers indeed preferred unsettled isles and harbor sites, but if unpopulated options were lacking, depopulated options would have to do. Accordingly, the later history of these expeditions contained repeated invasions, settled territory, and refoundations of cities. It would not be fair to say that all these expeditions had utopian pretensions. However, the ideas behind ideal societies in literature sharply affected how these colonists went about their settlements. Let me turn first to the classical side. The colonization of the Western Mediterranean was largely completed in the Archaic period, prior to the writings of Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. These historians present a dynamic of several waves of colonization, in which the earliest settlers settled on coastlines and offshore islands and traded with the locals inland. To explain this dynamic, Thucydides posits a period of naval raiding and piracy throughout the Mediterranean, so that all the great cities of the Greek world were inland hill forts that later spread to include ports. Several times, colonies set out with the goal of designing a better colony. For example, the 6th century Pythagorean settlements may have been such, though we know little about them. Hippodamus of Miletus, famous for both urban planning and political philosophy, was said to have designed a philosopher's colony at Thurii in southern Italy, and he was joined there by numerous 5th century thinkers, notably the historian Herodotus and the philosopher Protagoras. Sailing away to found a colony was not always forward-looking, however. Many of the Greek colonists were looking instead to escape civil war, escape discord, more than looking for a new thing. Accordingly, these classical ideas of ideal states were often rooted in how to avoid the same troubles in the departing state. Dissatisfaction with the contemporary situation led ancient writers to posit an ideal society would perhaps only suffer from dealing with the outside world, and so these communities tend to interact little with outsiders. Sailing is important because the sea then serves as a defense against dangers, both physical and moral. Early ideas of utopia, such as we see in Homer, Hesiod, and Pindar, depict distant lands which toil is unnecessary. Later ideas we see in Platonic and Stoic philosophy present this sort of soft paradise as undesirable. Soft lands will create a soft people. Strangely enough, this early idea of the far-off utopia somewhat coincides with the early period of Greek colonization in the 8th to 6th centuries, in which the settlers found unsettled sites to claim, while the second side somewhat coincides with later settlement of the 5th and 4th century, many of which involve driving the existing inhabitants off to claim their land. Still later in the Hellenistic period, geographical writers wrote tales of distant land beyond the Mediterranean, and they focus on these two things: how productive is the local landscape, and how functional are the local politics and customs. They don't tend to describe great works of art or inventions, as we see more locally with Pausanias, nor do they describe games, and they usually don't describe festivals or even trade. They tend to be very focused on whether the land is fertile, the crops abundant, and how the city or country is ruled. Moreover, there's a tendency to depict islands as particularly wonderful. So in this genre of geographical writing, we have distant places described as paradises, which are very much shaped by these two different philosophical ideas. In handout 2, I have a couple here that you four have all seen before. I'm counting myself as one of the four. Right? We have one of these Golden Age stories in which in Hesiod compared with the geographical wonder in Diodorus and Iambulus. In some cases, these paradises are obvious fiction. Thoughtful thought experiment is what an ideal society would look like, such as Plato's Republic or the description of Atlantis, or in Plutarch's De Facie, while in others, like the 1st century writer Diodorus Siculus, believe they are representing real societies which happen to eschew trade, be situated on islands, interact minimally with others, and were self-sufficient in everything. Once established, the idea that utopia had to be isolated was even introduced into the oldest of tales, such as the Telchian settlement of Rhodes in handout 3. Right? So we have here the historian Orosius writing in the 5th century CE, writing about something that theoretically happened 23 centuries earlier, fitting into the same model. A little time later, these same Tel-Qins, defeated in war, fleeing their homeland in ignorance of how matters stood, believing they were secluding themselves in a safe place away from contact with all human settlement, seized the island of Rhodes, which was previously called Ophiucha. Furthermore, we come across a very peculiar instance in the 1st century BC. A Roman general by the name of Quintus Sertorius, amidst the civil wars of the early 1st century, arrived in Cadiz and learned about a small archipelago in the Atlantic, describing all the wondrous details of the far-flung Utopia. I see 2 references here in handout 4, one from Sallust, one from Plutarch. And instead of marching right back into the fight in the Civil War, Sertorius considers taking his men, sailing off into the Atlantic, and setting up a new country there. However, his men are disinclined to do so, and his pirate mercenaries even desert him. Without his fleet, Sertorius then determines to set up a Roman exile in Spain. So both of these ideas of finding Utopia and founding Utopia are present. Initially, Sertorius desires to find Utopia in the Islands of the Blessed, and after those hopes are dashed, then he seeks to found Utopia, a functional Roman state, with the resources he has on hand. Now, Sertorius did not achieve either form of an ideal state, assassinated about 4 years later, but the later writers Plutarch and Sallust sought to represent Sertorius as more interested in the sort of hard, disciplined Utopia, while the historic Sertorius, I argue, was more likely to be influenced by these earlier Greek writers and the colonization of the Western Mediterranean, in that the return to civil war is only undertaken when the easy option has vanished. Now, a striking difference between the classical and post-classical period in the description of colonial utopia is the role of commerce. As I mentioned, most of the classical utopian landscapes depict lands which eschew trade and commerce and exist in idyllic self-sufficiency. And More's Utopia and Bacon's New Atlantis both depict societies that leave off in commerce, corruption, and greed. But early colonial narratives were instead keen to depict the lands of the Americas in terms that emphasize their commercial value, particularly in terms of exports of raw agricultural goods like indigo or coffee, among many others. Despite More's criticism of England's over-reliance on the cloth trade, other early writers saw the New World as a potential market for English wool. They retained utopian narratives' presentation of lush land, but turned to the potential of economic exploitation. And both retain the colonial impetus of discharging excess population, as we see in handout 5. And I'm not going to read it because I'm running a little bit short on time. The finding-founding distinction holds true in colonial narratives. I'd like to close with an analysis of one such episode, the unusual colonial venture of Gregor MacGregor. In 1821, Gregor MacGregor, a colorful character and adventurer, a veteran of the wars in Spain's former colonies, arrived in England with the proposition to settle a colony in Central America. MacGregor himself had titles of land from the local king of the Mosquito and had an extensive guidebook published. His guidebook depicted Poyais as already cleared and partially settled, to some degree interconnected with friendly natives who desired artisans and craftsmen. The land was said to be fertile, with investment in Caribbean crops to pay off within 5 years and even earlier. But MacGregor's colonists instead found themselves undersupplied in a deserted jungle ravaged by disease, while MacGregor continued to seek funding and colonists back in Europe. Now, this episode has long been seen as a fraud by a con man, selling near useless land to would-be settlers, selling land allotments he never owned, and engaging in high-risk speculation on the London stock market. Indeed, a popular biography named it the most audacious fraud in history. Others have more recently pushed back on this representation of MacGregor, suggesting that the fraud is in fact more due to sheer incompetence than it was to dishonesty. What I would like to suggest here in this remaining time is that this distinction I frame between colonial leaders thinking about founding an ideal city on the far off shore and colonial participants in thinking about finding idyllic land where they can prosper may play a role in interpreting this episode as well. That is, MacGregor offered would-be colonists an opportunity to settle in a perfect land, that is, an alleged act of finding utopia, but instead intended them to force them to found a city in a deserted Central American jungle, an act of founding utopia. And he may have had the nearby British colony of Belize in mind, a bustling Caribbean port initially found in somewhat similar circumstances. This con may have been more than a con. MacGregor's military success, such as it was, came from delivering his troops to the right place at a reasonable time, and expecting them simply to do what they had to do while watching from a safe distance. This was not a strategy that made him popular amongst his men, nor his allies, but somehow it was fairly effective. He appears to have a bit of a knack for target selection, finding undermanned forts and poorly defended ports and capitalizing on the weaknesses. Moreover, he sent multiple ships to 𝘴𝘰s with colonists and supplies, apparently insufficient in both. He put together an elaborate constitution for the colony, though apparently cribbing heavily from Bolivar's constitution for Venezuela, and he genuinely had an agreement with George Frederick, but not of the scale that he claimed. While we may reckon this to merely the trappings of a successful Khan, it does represent an expenditure of time and effort disproportionate to the gains. It seems, therefore, it might be worth considering the expeditions to 𝘴𝘰s as a civilian version of his military tactics. By delivering the colonists to a potentially suitable location, removing their wherewithal to go elsewhere, MacGregor prompted the colonists to found a settlement. They may have been promised Utopia, but lacking choices, they would be, in theory, forced to create it themselves. Now, the expected colony never materialized, and that stretch of coast is still undeveloped today, but MacGregor's failure, like that of Sertorius, may nevertheless reveal how they thought of distant settlements. With the best sites taken, one might naturally turn to attempt to force a successful colony instead of finding one. Thank you.
Okay, so let's soldier on then. So the next paper is from Ryan Denson. So Ryan Denson is a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter. His research interests concern the supernatural, folklore, and the ancient imagination. His PhD thesis, supervised by Daniel Ogden, focuses on sea monsters and a variety of other marine entities. He has a forthcoming article in the journal Green Letters entitled Divine Nature and the Natural Divine, the Marine Folklore of Pliny the Elder, and is also contributing an entry on sirens and harpies for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Monsters in Classical Myth. Ryan, I'll let you take it away. Have you sort of spotted yourself so that your picture is your image of your head is taking up the screen? Yeah. Okay. So please take it away, and very much looking forward to hearing this paper. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So utopian worlds flourish in exotic spaces that are inherently alien relative to whatever one wishes to deem as the quote unquote normal world, usually distanced by either temporal or spatial means. Thomas More's own Utopia, it will be recalled, was set in the New World, a place that was at least for the 16th century Europeans, still a realm largely of unknowns, simultaneously offering up the imaginative potential for encounters with monsters and as well as alternate versions of human society. Early in that narrative, Thomas More describes the conversation with his interlocutor, stating, quote, "We made no inquiries after monsters, things than which there is nothing more common. But it is not so easy to find states that are well and wisely governed," end quote. Thus, More rejects, for that text at least, the opposing tradition that such alien spaces are also frequently portrayed as the habitats of monstrosities, preferring instead to use this space as a canvas to paint his own political utopia. We can then see a similar premise for the depths of the seas as a realm that is inherently foreign relative to the terrestrial existence of humans. In Greco-Roman antiquity, the marine world was often depicted as harboring fantastical beasts. Yet, like More, my concern, at least in this work, is not with sea monsters, but rather with how we imagine humans or anthropic divinities in such utopic contexts. Utopias within underwater spaces, both in the ancient and modern worlds, however, also substantially go beyond the spatial premise that underlies the utopia of More and others. Unlike imagined terrestrial societies that are distanced from the normal world along a horizontal axis, these underwater worlds instead are distanced from our familiar world along a vertical axis, being specifically below the sea surface that makes up the realm of daily life for sailors. Attendant this shift in spatial terms is also another theme that frequently concerns going beyond the conventional limits of humanity, venturing away from the terrestrial nature of all hitherto existing human settlements. Such aquatic settings for utopias, I argue, are predicated upon the desire to imagine and to project such possibilities for anthropic settlements into the underwater domain, overcoming the inherent challenges of such through either divine attributes or technological advancements. So here I will very, very briefly touch upon some instances in antiquity and modern speculative fiction genres of fantasy and science fiction where underwater utopias can be seen with such themes. Though this is certainly by no means the only examples of such, we can also note in passing the potential that such underwater spaces have for the portrayal of alternative societies in dystopian fiction, as well as fans of the video game BioShock will know, though such depictions seem rare in comparison to the much more prevalent underwater utopias. So to begin with the subject of underwater utopic spaces in antiquity, we can note that these are habitually clustered around notions of the marine divinities in Greek mythology. Our most substantial narrative concerns a venture to Poseidon's underwater palace depicted by the lyric poet 𝘱𝘰𝘮𝑦𝘭𝑥, writing in the 5th century BC. This comes from his 17th ode, framed within the context of the more well-known myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. Here, Theseus is on the boat sailing to Crete with the other Athenian youths to be sacrificed to that monster. 𝘱𝘰𝘮𝑦𝘭𝑥 describes a conflict that ensues between Theseus and Minos on the boat, with each one boasting of their divine lineages, Theseus as the son of Poseidon and Minos as the son of Zeus. Minos, however, disputes Theseus's descent from Poseidon and challenges him to prove it by retrieving a ring that he has just tossed into the sea. Theseus, with no hesitation, dives overboard, and as the poem describes, quote, "The sea-dwelling dolphins quickly conveyed great Theseus to the home of his father, the god of horses, and went to the palace of the gods," end quote. Down here, in this divine abode, Theseus encounters not his father Poseidon, but the Nereids in Amphitrite, Poseidon's wife. He is gifted with a robe and crown, and he returns to the surface, appearing at the side of the boat, resplendent with his newfound regalia, much to the surprise of Minos. With this catapontic journey, that is a journey down into the sea, and his return to the surface, Theseus proves his lineage to the sea god. The underlying significance of this accomplishment is one that is quintessentially premised upon overcoming contemporary limits of humanity. The lack of any modern diving equipment in the ancient world imposed a strict limitation upon ancient divers, who were restricted to that few meters below the surface where one is able to swim while holding their breath, the remainder of the vast underwater world being entirely inaccessible. Yet though this aquatic world is ostensibly separate from the mortal normal world, Theseus' status as a demigod allows him to break such a practical limit. It is his divine lineage that allows him to cross over from the traditionally terrestrial world of mortals into an aquatic space. In this way, Poseidon's underwater palace benefits from the spatial shifting of a utopic space to a location that is otherwise impossible to reach for mortals. Meanwhile, the other divine entities that dwell in such a space, Nereids, and in some other sources, Tritons, are themselves all anthropic or mixanthropic denizens of the deep. These human and half-human forms, alongside the very notion of their dwelling in a space that is considered as a regal structure, such as a palace, allows this space to generally be elusive of actual terrestrial civilizations on the surface. While divinity itself is not necessarily a utopic quality, here it serves to elevate this realm as being superior to the mortal terrestrial realm, and thus carving out a paradisical space within the principally hostile depths of the sea. So when we turn then to the world of modern speculative fiction in the 20th and 21st centuries, we can observe much the same fascination with imagining types of underwater utopias. Certainly we have made greater explorative forays into the underwater world since 𝘱𝘰𝘮𝑦𝘭𝑥 time, as with the invention of submarines, of course, owing also to high-definition cameras and the abundance of nature documentaries. Much of us also have a better visual sense of what such an underwater world should look like. Yet, for the time being, establishing permanent settlements underneath the waves is still a practical impossibility. Consequently, we have a flourishing of underwater abodes, both derived from the reception of Greco-Roman mythology in modern fantasy in the more indirect instantiations in the science fiction genre. Perhaps one of the most well-known examples of such settings in the modern reception of Greek mythology comes in Madeline Miller's *Circe*. In connection with the novel's theme of immortality, it is significant that much of Circe's early life takes place in such palaces of the gods, mostly that of her father, Helios. The neighboring palace of Oceanus, which, though never explicitly said to be underwater, is still characterized by the faint sounds of the World River. Elsewhere in the novel, once the mortal Glaucus gains divine status, we are told that he is introduced by the other sea god Nereus to Poseidon himself, and that, quote, together they helped him shape his underwater palace set with gold and wave-racked treasures, end quote, implying here and elsewhere that each of the marine gods has a marine palace of their own. And so Glaucus's ascendancy to divinity has also earned him one. Circe's exile from the community of the gods significantly then occurs in a manner that banishes her from these palaces of the gods and onto her own island. It is here on an island world that she is brought into contact more frequently with mortal sailors. Such an island space, in the context of this text at least, serves then as something of an intermediary realm for the mortal characters to encounter divinities like Circe, while the divine palaces and their connection to impossible spaces like the sea depths consequently remains abodes for the gods and goddesses alone. And then within the other primary branch of modern speculative fiction, that of science fiction, we have our other main source of underwater utopic settings, which are sometimes elusive of ancient mythology, though by no means can they be said to derive wholly from that tradition. With this shift in genre comes also an expanded version of the basic concept. The ancient version of Poseidon's underwater palace in Bacchylides and its successors in modern reception never quite rises to the status of a polis, the ancient Greek term for a city and its surrounding area. They are habitually just the palaces alone for most texts. The science fiction versions of such spaces, however, frequently concern whole underwater cities instead, typically made possible by being constructed underneath some sort of dome. Alastair Reynolds' Poseidon's Children series provides an interesting example of such. The first novel, Blue Remembered Earth, features the underwater city of Tiamat, a name, of course, derived from the Babylonian sea goddess of the sea. Descriptions include similar forms of modern construction, as well as mention of green spaces, doubtlessly imitating the gardens of the terrestrial world. And in this way, we can see another type of projection of terrestrial societies into an aquatic space, with the advanced technology of such domed worlds making the previously impossible space now possible to inhabit. Another instance of a domed underwater world can be seen much earlier in Isaac Asimov's Lucky Star and the Oceans of Venus, which also serves as an interesting note to end this very, very brief survey of underwater worlds. Here, the underwater cities in question are set not on Earth's seas, but those of the planet Venus, imagined in this story as being an almost entirely marine world, as was often the case based on contemporary theories about the planet's surface. The largest of these cities being called Aphrodite, another salute to an ancient Greek mythological figure with marine affinities, yet the combination of the setting being an aquatic realm and a location on another planet entirely, with this spatial shift, this makes the spatial shift from the terrestrial aquatic realm furthermore becomes extraterrestrial entirely. Human aspirations for travel across the sea have long been put side by side with that of travel into outer space. Both, after all, deal substantially with this motif of stretching the very limits of human possibilities. And here in Asimov's book, we can glimpse the blending of the two final frontiers of human exploration and settlement. To wrap up then, the fundamental element of underwater spaces as utopic realms is is being marked off as a space conceptually similar to, though distinct from, contemporary human habitations on the surface world. The aquatic world then serves as something of an ideal blank canvas with which to experiment in pushing the limits of human settlements with potential utopian worlds. Yet these underwater worlds are still contingent on historical circumstances. Moore's setting in the New World nowadays seems a strange locus for a utopia of any kind, precisely owing to the European colonization of the continents of North and South America. In like manner, if humanity should ever come to inhabit the ocean floors on a mass scale, we shall see a similar tapering off of underwater spaces as having utopian or dystopian potential in our collective imagination, that blank canvas having then become infected by reality and becoming instead a banal space, and thus perhaps leaving outer space as the only true final frontier onto which we can project our imagined possibilities. And thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ryan, for the super paper. So I would like now to get to our third panelist, also discussing later, 𝘧𝘰𝘭𝘵. So Georgia is sharing her screen, super. So Georgia has a PhD from CU Boulder, where she worked on military religion in Roman Britain, and her research interests are broad, including history of science, Latin and Greek pedagogy, Greek and Roman religion and mythology. Among her publications are a companion to Science, Technology, and Medicine in Ancient Greece and Rome, Conceptions of the, that's by Wiley Blackwell, Conceptions of the Watery World in Greco-Roman Antiquity by Bloomsbury, Using and Conquering the Watery World in the Greco-Roman Antiquity, also by Bloomsbury, and many more publications. So, Georgia, I'll leave it to you then, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say on our utopic topic. Okay.
Thank you so much, Hamish. Scheria was the distant mythical island home of the Phaeacians in Homer and Apollonius, authors separated by 4 centuries or more, authors with vastly different cultural, political, and social milieus. Consequently, there are 2 Scherias in Greek lore, deriving from distinct traditions and giving voice to different social and political stresses at different points in time. Here we shall examine the Homeric tradition in order to explore how the cracks in the utopic armor reflect the angst of the era in which it was produced. Time does not allow an investigation of Apollonius' Scheria, which, unlike Homer's, was not isolated, nor did it disappear. Scheria was a legendary island paradise in the Homeric world, equipped with a towering wall, a double harbor, one at each side of the city, connected by a narrow causeway. Each ship had its own slip, framing a fine precinct of Poseidon, a god who protects sailors at sea. Is a quarried stone assembly house where the Phaeacians store their nautical tack, hawsers, sail, and oar blades. They are a seafaring people who joyfully ply the gray sea. They are concerned with masts and oars and balanced vessels, and they are appropriately descended from Poseidon, their divine patron, grandfather of their king Alcinous, great-grandfather of their queen Arete. The Phaeacians are dear to the immortals, but they are isolationists, living apart on a distant island, far from toiling men. Alcinous' father 𝘧𝘰𝘠 had led his people from Hyperia, an island near Sicily where Poseidon's Cyclopean children dwelt. 𝘧𝘰𝘠's people could not tolerate their overbearing cousins who kept harrying them. At Scheria, the folk indulge in a luxurious Greek lifestyle that includes feasting, bards, and athletic competitions. Wanting for nothing, moreover, Homer's Phaeacians are privy to the latest news, including the fall of Troy. And they possess up-to-date hydraulic technologies, including irrigated gardens, as in evidence at Minoan palaces, a fine harbor, and rudderless ships. Although they are famous for their hospitality because strangers and wanderers are sacred in the sight of Zeus, Homer's Phaeacians nonetheless fulfill their obligations of hospitality, xenia, circumspectly. Athena warns Odysseus that the Phaeacians lack patience for foreigners, nor do they lovingly entertain them. Rose, 1969, observes that the Phaeacians mistrust Odysseus and that the Ithacan hero must gain the loyalty of a people who are far from ready to offer a haven where uncertainty and hostility are suspended. The commoners might find fault with Odysseus, as Nausicaa warns, and Athena hides Odysseus in a mist as he enters the city, fearing that some noble might sneer at him, a fear that is fulfilled when the noble Euryalus accuses Odysseus of being nothing more than a greedy merchant and of not looking like an athlete, in other words, of not being nobly born. Odysseus must then prove himself in order to gain acceptance from his suspicious hosts. Alcinous, furthermore, is an inept host, as Rose argues, ignorant of the protocol of Xenia, perhaps owing to his own lack of experience, in my opinion. Odysseus first sits in the ashes while the king contemplates the situation. Alcinous fails to offer hospitality promptly. The king is then urged by his advisor, Echenios, the most advanced in age, the one who surpassed all in words, knowing many things from times past, presumably from a time when the Phaeacians were not so isolated. Echenius alone of the Scarians seems conversant with the niceties of Xenia, and he rebukes the king for his lack of leadership and for humiliating a guest. Echenius then outlines the proper sequence of offering entertainment. Despite Echenius' guidance, Alcinous continues to miss the mark as soon as the meal is served. Alcinous dives into a lengthy speech, suggesting that Odysseus may be a god in disguise. This is a not so subtle attempt to draw Odysseus out before the ritual moment for asking identities has arrived after the dinner. Rose concludes that Phaeacian hospitality is very incomplete, especially in contrast with the exemplary hosts featured in the Odyssey, Nestor, Menelaus, and Eumaeus, whose hospitality is prompt, spontaneous, and warm. The difference, however, is that a prior relationship exists between those hosts and their guests. Nestor is only too happy to regale Telemachus with stories of the war, and Menelaus is paternal and supportive. Telemachus' identity is not revealed to his host until after he is feasted, but the listener, the audience, is aware of the bond. Eumaeus also learns of the feigned connection between his guest and master after a modest feast, but again, the audience knows. It is a tight-knit community with complex links of family and friendship. We recall that Penelope is related by blood to Helen and Clytemnestra. They are cousins. What then accounts for the difference? On the surface, the Phaeacians are the model of Zeus-fearing, Xenia-offering Greeks, but a closer reading, as we've just seen, reveals chinks in the Xenia armor. With regard to their wariness and incomplete hospitality, the Phaeacians likely reflect an underlying social anxiety. Homeric epics were recorded at a time of robust exploration and settlement of the Mediterranean from the 8th to 7th centuries. And in the Homeric archaic account, the Odyssey, where Alcinous' court is leery of Odysseus, we see expressions of the fears that Greeks themselves may have felt regarding what settlers may have found in new territories. Like Odysseus, someone who travels to a new and unknown land will ask, are the inhabitants savage and without justice, or are they hospitable to strangers with a godly mind? Woven into the epic cycle are tales of migration and settlement. Owing to their brutal war crimes against the gods at Troy, the theft of Athena's cult statue, the Palladium, the lesser Ajax's brutal rape of Cassandra in Athena's temple, and Neoptolemus' murder of King Priam's youngest son, Polites, at Zeus's altar, several returning heroes were punished by the gods. The retributions are formulaic. The epic warriors returned to troubled homes and were expelled. Escaping from their enemies, they sought refuge abroad and founded 𝘬𝘭𝘥𝘭𝘴, homes away, where they were worshipped as heroes when they died. Diomedes, for example, had wounded Aphrodite and Ares in battle in the Iliad, and Aphrodite devised a suitable retribution. Returning to Argos, Diomedes found an unfaithful wife who tried to kill him, replicating the Nostos of Agamemnon, who was slain by his jealous wife, Clytemnestra at Mycenae. Diomedes escaped to Apulia in southern Italy, where he founded cities and was worshipped with a hero cult. Early Greek settlement was motivated by stresses of population growth and a desire, perhaps, to extend influence and networks of resources. Corcyra was reputedly the first Greek 𝘱𝘭𝘥𝘪 in the Adriatic Sea, founded by the Corinthian Cheryscrates and Archias in 733 BC, when the barbarians were ousted. The people of Scheria, moreover, were themselves migrants, establishing a new homeland after experiencing the less than hospitable behavior of their overbearing Cyclopean cousin neighbors, who kept harrying them, being greater in strength. Furthermore, the act of settlement was often violent, resulting in the extermination or expulsion of indigenous residents. The original inhabitants of Corcyra were expelled. We asked then, what of the original inhabitants of Scheria? The sources are silent. Was the island uninhabited? This seems unlikely. Did the Phaeacians have the indigenous peoples violently removed? The Phaeacians seem to have the island to themselves. Moreover, often, but not universally, an 𝘱𝘭𝘥𝘪 would retain trade and cultural exchange with its metropolis, and the Odyssey suggests that the Phaeacians were involved in long-distance trade. The Phaeacians knew the cities of men, and they sped across the waters in their paradoxical ships under Poseidon's isolationist protection, under the cover of mist and cloud. Like the mist that descends on 𝘧𝘰𝘮𝑦𝘭𝑥, protecting its innocent residents from the exigencies of time. Homer's Phaeacians were isolationists, fearing strangers, fearing encroachment into their new homeland, fearing divine retribution, and fearing, perhaps, that they might suffer the same fate that they had inflicted on an earlier population of their island. Their fear is transferred from the invaders who might destroy their way of life to the god who's promised annihilation should they aid strangers on Poseidon's realm. Like earlier residents of so many lands that had been settled by the Greeks, the Phaeacians also disappear from the Greek mythscape. The Phaeacians are caught between two powerful gods, Zeus, who protects travelers, and their own divine patron and progenitor, Poseidon. Phaeacian reticence in offering hospitality links to the tradition that Poseidon objected to such civilities. Poseidon would yet be angry with us because we are convoy without hurt to all men, Alcinous says. The Phaeacians would be appropriately punished and prevented from offering conveyance ever again. One day, after Phaeacian convoy returned from an act of hospitality, Poseidon would, according to legend, pile a great mountain over our city to hide it. When he learns of Odysseus' return to Ithaca, Poseidon is naturally angry and threatens to make good the prophecy. Zeus suggests a mitigated punishment, closing off the shore to prevent travel to and from Scheria. But do not hide their city under a mountain, Zeus requests. Alcinous himself declares the prophecy fulfilled, but optimistically organizes a sacrifice to assuage Poseidon's anger, in order that he might not pile high a mountain over our city. The island's fate is deliberately left ambiguous, exacerbated by a textual difficulty. Does Zeus urge destruction, 𝑚𝑒𝑔𝑎_ōros, or amelioration, 𝑚ē? Nonetheless, standing around their altar while praying to Poseidon, Homer's Phaeacians disappear. Western authors continue to explore social anxieties via hidden utopias across the sea. In Wilhelm Gerstocker's 𝘰𝘮𝑚𝑒𝑙shausen, published in 1862, a tiny village in the German countryside is cursed to appear from the mist only one day each century, disappearing first in 1224. The village embodies the ideals of a simpler pre-industrial, pre-Bismarck world, the romantic heritage of the German people. Although not across the sea, the hidden utopia lay beyond a dilapidated bridge and within a swamp. Water remains the defining boundary. The good folk of 𝘰𝘮𝑚𝑒𝑙shausen clearly recognize their fate is a curse that is unexplained in the short story. The tale was recast in a Lerner and Loewe musical. Lerner flatly denied any inspiration from Gerstocker, claiming the plot was a product of his own imagination. The musical was, of course, 𝘧𝘰𝘮, where the disappearance of the village of 𝘧𝘰𝘮 in the Scottish Highlands is seen not as a curse, at least by most of the residents, but as a blessing. The parish priest had made a deal with God that Brigadoon would appear from the mist one day every century so that there'd be no change in the lives of the people. They just would not be in any century long enough to be touched by it. Like Homer's Phaeacians, Mr. Forsyth is the paramount xenophobe, seeking to eschew all influence from outsiders. The tension is between the godly goodness of the Scottish people and the corrupting, destructive witches from the outside who were, to quote Mr. Forsyth, taking the Scottish people away from the teachings of God and putting the devil in their souls. Church versus secularism, tradition versus progress. Most of the residents signed on willingly. The jilted Harry Beaton is the sole exception. While Fiona's Nausicaa is warm and inviting to the two grouse hunters from the New World, the other residents are skeptical. At first, they refuse to talk to Tommy and Jeff or sell them something for their breakfast, until Charlie invites the strangers to his wedding, extending the same hospitality afforded by Menelaus to Telemachus in the Odyssey, a welcome during a joyous family celebration. Whether a mist that rises once a century or a wall of rock surrounding an island, the effect is the same, essential isolation from the world. The Phaeacians and the Highlanders of Brigadoon are both marooned in Utopia, a blessing or a curse. We must each decide for ourselves. And thank you. And now I will unhighlight myself. I know I can do this. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our coordinator, Hamish Williams, who is a Humboldt Fellow at the Department of English and American Studies, FSU Jena, and from October will be a fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. He has previously taught international studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. His research work is spread across the subdisciplines of classical reception studies and modern popular fiction studies. His recent book publication is the edited volume, Tolkien and the Classical World. Hamish.
So today I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be moving to the modern world primarily in my speech. I'll be talking about Minoan Crete, but from modern perspectives. Okay, so the topic on my paper is the Minoan Sublime, narrating experiences at Utopia Minoica. Okay, so just a quick outline of the program for my speech. I'll be talking, just briefly summarizing some ancient utopias and modern popular imagination in 20th century. Then discussing Minoan Crete as a modern construct, specifically different types of utopias which have been superimposed over this Bronze Age thalassocracy and paradise, right? And then lastly, I'll be moving to my particular focus on the Minoan sublime, the sort of subjective, experiential realizations which come about on various sites, on various ruins in Crete. Specifically, I'll be looking at Nikos Kazantzakis' Zorba the Greek, and if I have time, I'll quickly summarize Henry Miller's discussions of his travels in Greece and Crete in the Colossus of Marousi. Both of these works are sort of late modernist period, right? 1941 for Miller and 46 for Kazantzakis. Okay, so there are several different classic traditions of ancient utopia which are prevalent in modern popular fiction and culture. So we can think obviously first of Atlantis. Plato's Atlantis relies on his Critias and Timaeus. And we can look at fantasy writings like Tolkien's Middle-earth mythologies and his stylization of this hidden island called Numenor, as pictured on the top right. We can think about children's literature and Disney's Atlantis. I think that was in about 2001. We can go to the genre of science fiction. I recently read this book. It's surprisingly good, by Poul Anderson, The Dancer from Atlantis. It also has a Minoan theme, so it's a bit relevant to today's discussion. And we can also look at the genre of documentary filmmaking, and whether it's on a History Channel or Discovery Channel, and this kind of relates to conspiracy theories about discovering the real Atlantis. So we have this sort of genre of documentary films, right, which will look at the possibility of some real Atlantis somewhere in the Atlantic or in South America or wherever. Okay, so that's one sort of tradition of ancient utopia and modern fiction and culture. We also have sort of idealized barbarian landscapes, whether it's Asterix in Gaul, sort of Tolkien's quasi-Germanic Riders of Rohan, sort of in a sort of migration age just after the collapse of the Roman Empire, in contrast to his people of Gondor, who are sort of reimagined late Romans. And we can look at various. It's a very popular sort of subgenre in computer games. There's sort of this Germanic world, whether it's Oblivion or I've pictured there Gothic 3, which I used to play. And there's again this, I think, tension between this idealized pastoral Germanic, whether milieu versus sort of this ordered, controlling imperialistic Roman empire. I think that's represented by the orcs in Gothic 3, actually. Okay. What more? So Rome itself is, I think, most often a dystopia, you would say, especially in film. We can think in terms of the 50s blockbusters like Quo Vadis, where Nero, burns down Rome, and Rome is kind of the antithesis to the sort of this idealized early Christian community, which meets in secret at night, right? So the sort of Rome is antithesis to this early Christian society. We can think Spartacus, right? The crucifixion of the slaves, right? It's not a welcoming place. In Gladiator 2000 with Russell Crowe, Rome is, quote, the mob in the film. So it's a sort of autocracy, right? So in various ways, it's been stylized as a sort of dystopian, corrupted space, which has various modern political parallels, perhaps. Okay, but today I'm going to be talking about Minoan Crete as a utopia. It's in the bottom of the map there. I think Henry Miller describes it, or I think Lawrence Durrell describes it as looking like the case of a cello. So there it is in the bottom of the Aegean, between Asia Minor and the Peloponnese. And I think when we talk about Minoan Crete, it's probably a bit confusing for the non-expert, because there's all these, the question is, whose Minoan Crete are we talking about? Are we talking about archaeologists and their study of the genuine ruins of this Bronze Age people, and even to use the word Minoans to sort of collectivize many different city-states or city communities in Crete is problematic? Are we talking about the classical Greek memory of ancient Cretans? Maybe we shouldn't probably use the word Minoans for that. There's sort of the Theseus myths. Thucydides' discussion of Minos's early thalassocracy. So some references also in Herodotus. Diodorus Siculus, right? So all these references scattered here and there in Greek mythology, or are we talking about Minoan Crete as a modern construct, which is what I'm talking about today. And you see there a picture of Mary Renault's King Must Die. It's probably one of the most well-known receptions of Minoan Crete in the 20th century. Also in 1958, she penned that historical fiction, one of my faves. Okay, so there's this various examples of receptions, popular works across the genres. I'm not going to summarize all of these, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, modernist fiction. I'll be talking about a little bit of Greek today. Sort of postmodernist literary fiction with The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break, right? Reinventing, rehashing various aspects of Minoan Crete, whether it's the island itself, the people, the symbols of the island, the Minotaur, the axe, the sort of feminine priestess. I've recently been reading a lot of Minoan horror, which I won't get into today. But there is a sort of tension in modern receptions between sort of this horrific aspect of the island, which is particularly inherited from classical Greek stories, and the sort of more utopian perspective, which is was really embellished by the archaeological writings of this gentleman here, so Arthur Evans, in the early 1900s, and his 4-volume set, The Palace of Minos, I think it's called, or The Palace at Knossos. And for him, the Minoan Cretans and Minoan Crete was really a kind of retrospective paradise, a quasi-British, a very British sort of thalassocracy, a sea kingdom, right? They were very peaceful, they were traders. So we can see British ideals in the colonial period, 19th century here, that they were just really bringing culture to India and China and knowledge. And it was specific in its nature. So we have political analogues. And this for him was really the sort of the founding Western civilization. Okay, so that's Arthur Evans, and then throughout the 20th century we have various takes on what this modern utopia could, this Minoan utopia could be. We have feminist sort of interpretations, most famously Robert Graves' work, captured in his treatise The White Goddess, but the novelistic treatment a bit easier to read is 7 Days in New Crete. Paul Anderson, I've already read The Dancer from Atlantis, where Atlantis is part of the Minoan Empire. There's often this link made in popular fiction between Atlantis and Minoan Crete. The Lily and the Bulls, another one which kind of has this yin-yang approach of the male versus female in Minoan Crete, right? There's also takes which see it as, I've already talked about this in another paper, which is Minoan Crete as sort of Eastern utopia, sort of a Minoan Shangri-La, focusing on the interior of Crete, the great mountains in Crete. So something which Lawrence Durrell kind of constructed in his work, The Dark Labyrinth. Lawrence Durrell was born at the foothills of the Himalayas, so for him, he kind of connected these two different utopias. It's also present in 𝘪𝘀 the Greek, because the anonymous narrator starts off the work finishing off a manuscript on Buddhism. He's very interested in Buddhism. So there is this connection between ideas of utopianism in Minoan Crete and Eastern philosophy, which was prevalent especially in the mid-20th century. But today I'm really going to be talking a bit more about subjective experiences or feelings of modernist narrators who go to those ruins and focusing on what they feel rather than prescriptive, objective manifestations of utopia, whether it's feminist utopia, Eastern utopia, a thalassocracy, a sort of quasi-British sea kingdom, or whatever. So I'm going to focus more on the emotional experience. So it's not just about emotions. Emotions are part of it. This experiential state of being in these, of walking to these ruins in Minoan Crete, and I'll call this the Minoan Sublime. And as I said, particularly looking at the narrator's voyages in 𝘧𝘰 the Greek and Henry Miller's autobiographic, quite creative travel book. To discuss what is the sublime, I'll probably need about an hour, and we wouldn't even get close. It's a very challenging topic in aesthetics. What is it all about? How do we define it? Well, it really depends which kind of sublime we're talking about, whether it's the romantic sublime, the classical sublime dating to Longinus and definitely before him even, the Christian sublime, right? So we have all these different takes in our cultural histories of what the sublime is. And it also depends which aesthetic theory we're looking at, whether it's Longinus or the English philosopher Edmund Burke or Immanuel Kant. They all have different takes on the sublime. And that's all just the theory of sublime. It's not the actual the literary interpretations of sublime, which is different to the phenomenological experience of the sublime by the average person. So it really depends what field we're coming from when we look at the sublime in terms of how we define it. Today, I'll just, for reasons of saving time, I'll just focus on 3 aspects of the sublime phenomenon, which is the sublime object. So basically a great exceptional object which triggers the sublime experience. It's often in the romantic imagination, but also in classical times, if you look at Longinus, it's the mountain, the great lake, this grand natural vista, which is seen usually by a solitary individual. It can also be a work of literature. And as we'll see, it can also be classical ruins, which trigger this transcendental sublime experience. The second stage, although they don't have to be consequential, they can be simultaneous, is the sublime affect or the emotions. And typically, if you read a lot of theory, this is really varying according to the aesthetic theory, but it's often focusing on tension between the two sides of awe or wonder, or wonder, which is this sort of a joy in Christian texts, often a divine sort of joy, but also, and particularly in Edmund Burke's treatise on the sublime, it's about terror and horror and sort of almost Dionysiac fear. So there's these two light and dark aspects to the divine experience emotionally, which are really characteristic. And lastly, and most importantly, perhaps you would say, if you're looking for the output, is there's some kind of realization of the sublime experience, which actually has two traditions. One is immaterial, which is about spiritual, coming to some sort of spiritual understanding, and one is the material sublime, which is just it's very common in romantic texts. It's this understanding, greater understanding of the infinitude and the diversity and the sort of plenitude of the natural world itself. So for further kind of studies on the sublime, I really recommend James Porter's work, The Sublime in Antiquity. It's really a phenomenal work, and it's not just on antiquity. It really gives a great theoretical introduction to understanding this concept. So for further and much more nuanced discussions, I recommend that work. Okay, as I said, I'm looking at Minoan sublime, but this idea of having a sublime object, talked about mountains, natural world as a sublime object, the idea of having classical ruins as a sublime object goes back to the Romantic period, really, with people like Lord Byron traveling to Greece and Rome and being amazed and having these, what I talked about as these different types of sublime experience, right, around Greek and Roman ruins. And often this led to certain ideals of freedom, of Hellenism, which these sort of transcendental realizations which were experienced being around these sublime objects, right? And these are obviously realized through the emotions of poetic texts. But today, what I really want to do, which I think is a bit more innovative, is to focus on the modernist period, a continuation of this idea of the romantic sublime while walking to classical ruins, but focusing on the modernist period in the 30s and 40s. Specifically, I think this is apparent in the works of Nikos Kazantzakis, Zorba the Greek, and as I say, Henry Miller's autobiographic travel work. So just to give a brief summary of Kazantzakis's novel, basically, the narrator is on a philosophical quest for wisdom or meaning in life. The external quest does not matter that much. He's in search of meaning. And to this end, the eccentric Zorba is a very important character who he looks up to and provides sort of a contrast to his bookish intellectual ego, right? And the key event in a novel is this anticipated love affair between the anonymous narrator and the anonymous widow who lives in this community in Crete. It's a physical event which really sort of disturbs the cerebral intellectual narrator. Okay, so an important passage in this book which I look at is when the narrator, who's in a state of mental sort of perturbation, he's quite confused, he decides to journey towards these Minoan ruins for, I would say, sublime experience. I didn't mention, but it's often very important in these sublime imaginings, especially in romantic texts, that the narrator enters the sublime text in a state of mental confusion or disturbance, or the geographic vista, the mountains, or whatever the sublime object is, triggers this feeling of mental uncertainty, which will then help this uncertainty, lack of clarity, will help the narrator come to some greater realization. So this is also part of the sublime experience. Okay, so here's an important passage in the Zorba the Greek, where the narrator discusses his journeying towards the ruins. During those oppressive days, when the sap was rising, I was myself prey to the prevailing springtime unrest. I took the pebbly mountain track. I had a sudden impulse to visit the small Minoan city, which had risen from the ground after 3,000 or 4,000 years, and was warming itself once more under its beloved Cretan sun. I thought that perhaps after 3 or 4 hours walk, fatigue would calm the rest that spring had brought. Okay, so again, we have this idea of he's got this unrest, which has been triggered by springtime. Okay, the Minoan ruins as a sublime object. So there's this association with the ruins with other aspects of a natural world, specifically mountains here. He's climbing up a mountainside, which is related often to the sublime in the romantic imagination. He's a solitary individual. He's all alone. He goes for a walk by himself up the mountainside towards the ruins. We have a description of the natural world among these ruins. So he describes an owl, which is grave and beautiful, full of mystery. These are such important adjectives for the sublime. It's not just beautiful, because beauty is often contrasted with the sublime, but it's a grave beauty. It's a serious, almost deadly beauty, you would say. And obviously mystery is also important part of the sublime experience, this enigmatic component. What's also important of with these ruins is a description of the luminosity, that the light which shines off these stones. It's something also which is very apparent in Miller's work. They're really glaring objects, the ruins, right? And the city itself is exceptional. It's given agency. It's risen from the ground, right? Almost magically. So it's really a sublime object, the Minoan ruins. And while he's present at the ruins, the narrator experiences sublime emotions, a mixture of positive wonder and terror. So I'll sort of excise this quotation. So when I came in sight of the small ruined city, I stood spellbound. Right, it must have been about noon. The sun's rays were falling perpendicularly and drenching stones with light. So it's a good feeling, right? It's full of light. But then we have this sort of more dark Dionysic side. In old ruined cities, this is a dangerous time of day, for the air is filled with cries and a noise of spirits. If a branch cracks, if a lizard darts, if a cloud throws a shadow as it passes overhead, panic seizes you. Every inch of ground you tread is grave, and you hear the dead groaning. Okay, so this is really a mortuary. I've given a picture of a Minoan cemetery there. It's this mixture of light and darkness, which is so characteristic of sublime experiences. It's wondrous because you can experience something great, some revelation, as we'll see, but it's also terrifying. It's potentially deadly. It's a dark Dionysiac sort of realm. Okay, and the last stage, he goes through this sublime transcendence. We might also call it a revelational epiphany. So at the ruins, he comes across this really pastoral, simple peasant who preaches a sort of Epicurean, simple philosophy to him about enjoying, all he has, the shepherd, is bread, cheese, olive water, and he wants a cigarette, and then he's happy. So it's all about the sort of material aspects, the pleasures of life, these simple pleasures, which connects to the earlier idea of spring being problematic for the narrator, whose spring symbolizes right, the material world, growth, fecundity, and the narrator stuck in his bookish head and filled with ideas. And this is so this narrative, this confrontation with the shepherd at these Minoan ruins is shattering his bookishness. He's later on in this narrative, he realizes that his whole life is being consumed by word ideas, whether it's love or nation or even now Buddhism, which was his latest craze. But he has to get over these ideas in order to arrive at some kind of appreciation of just the material world. So this is really the material sublime. It's, which is also the philosophy which 𝘧𝘰𝘮 represents, right, against the narrator's bookishness. And at the end of the chapter, he walks to the beach and looks at the waves, and he refers to the great mother's breast. So it's this is the idea of the great Cretan mother, right, and being a symbol of sort of primitive, intrinsic, ancient belief in the earth itself, right. Okay, so that's one side of this transcendent experience. It's about reverting to the material, away from all these ideologies in the book, which these ruins help the narrator to do. They help him process this philosophy. It's also got something to say about ideas of time, which is important in modernity. So the narrator comments quite a bit about the futility of human endeavors to conquer time. He describes the unfinished pottery of the Minoans, which are lying there, and on all these great works which were so important for the individuals then, right, but which are now just lying, right, half finished. So it makes me think a bit of Ozymandias when I describe it like that. Right, and when he sees the shepherd sort of confirms this. He wraps up this idea, and he says, "This is all dead." He's referring to the ruins, and we are alive. You do better to go quick. God be with you. So the idea is that these ruins are the place of the dead, and the narrator needs to live in the present. He needs to focus on the material world, and not be obsessed with discovering the ancient society here. He better go back to the sea, to the ocean, to the material milieu. Okay, I think I'm running out of time. All I can say is for Henry Miller's The Colossus of Marousi, that it's very similar. So the narrator, Miller, goes through various locales in Greece, which is really stylized as a paradise, in contrast to France or Britain or the US, which Miller's very much opposed to. And Miller again highlights this idea of, he goes to Phaistos, which is a bit more less populated by tourists, and Knossos, and he experiences this, he references the sublime, the serene height. So he goes up on the heights of the ruins and looks down and experiences this sublime moment, which for him, and also he experiences a sense of light, which Kazantzakis talks about. And this brings about a material transcendence. So here the most sublime thoughts are nullified. He's talking here about the transcendental spiritual sublime. What he experiences is just the physical immensity of existence, the infinitude of the universe. He later talks about the great vault, the roofless throne, the great vault, roofless, thrown open to infinity. Right. So this idea of infinitude of nature continuing endlessly. This is what he experiences at the ruins. But he also has something to say about the past. And he says specifically, Miller, I hadn't the faintest desire to snoop about examining lintels, urns, pottery, children's toys, votive cells, and such like. He's not interested in the past as past. He's interested in the past as it relates to the present. And so he later says in his travel work with Class of Maurici, he's here talking about his idol, Katsimbalis. And Katsimbalis spoke frequently of the past. It is true, not as something dead and forgotten, however, but rather as something which we carry within us, something which fructifies the present and makes the future inviting. So really these runes are useful for these narrators in as much as they can cast light on their feelings at the present and help them process these thoughts. I'm going to end there, and I think I'm going to head to Georgia for, if I can stop screen sharing, and I'm going to head to Georgia, who I think will give a review as a discussant of our panelists' sort of speeches thus far. Georgia?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. All right, sorry. First, I would like to thank Hamish for organizing this exciting and fun panel, and for asking me to serve as discussant. I am deeply honored, and for having allowed me to insinuate myself shamelessly onto the panel also as a presenter. Utopia, from the agricultural abundance of the Americas that incited the greed of the Virginia Company and others, to the black sand beaches of Tahiti that seduced Fletcher Christian to abandon a respectable life as a British serving naval officer for the dystopia of Pitcairn Island. There is no one-size-fits-all. Owing to their extreme distance and exoticism, we can project onto Utopia whatever imagined possibilities we will as reflections of our best selves, expressions of our social stresses and fears, as I argued in my talk, or shadows of our worst tendencies. To the Greeks and Romans, the distant Ethiopians were beloved by the sun god, thus explaining their permanent and dark suntans. The distant Hyperboreans, who dwelt at the crossroads between earth and sky, life and death, beyond the north wind and under the very pole of the stars, lived lives of perfect ease. And according to Julius Caesar, extreme distance from the corrosive influence of a feminizing Roman trade ensures the bravery and nobility of the Belgae. These utopias are protected by a significant spatial buffer that separates them from us. The ancients also envisioned dystopias at the edges of existence. Strabo, Mella, Pliny, and other geographical writers describe liminal places which are too torrid or monster-infested for human habitation. Writers also describe freakish human hybrids, the one-legged monocoli who hopped from place to place, folks with backward-facing feet, and the Panati of Scythia whose ears were so large that they served as blankets, cuddling themselves up in their ears, among many others. Mella and Pliny worked at Rome in the 1st century CE, a time when paradoxa from distant places were an obsession, as promoted in the literature and art of the times. Thus, Roman writers were projecting products of their own imaginings onto the world's margins, striking a lurid balance between mania and phobia. Paradoxa and dystopia aside, on the surface, ancient constructions of utopia seem to represent a golden age fantasy and retrospective nostalgic longing for a mythic past. But a deeper look reveals that, across time and space, utopia becomes a mechanism for exploring contemporary stresses and concerns. We have focused today on the ancient paradises discovered or created across or below the seas, away from the European mainland. Utopia is settlement, either discovered or founded, Utopia as a blank canvas upon which to push the limits of human settlement, Scheria in Minoan Crete, a utopia that has been constructed after the fact. The sea thus serves as a protective, insulating barrier between distant paradises or island utopias and corrupting external influences. It bears pointing out that insulate derives from insula, the Latin word for island, and as Ryan Denson observes, islands, or at least 𝘧𝘰𝘬𝘯𝘥, provide intermediary spaces where mortals can encounter divinities in Madeline Miller's 𝘧𝘰. Aaron Beek explores the philosophical framework of utopias as places or communities that were envisioned as fulfilling one or more of three primary criteria. A land in a pleasant climate that sustains the inhabitants who enjoy lives of perfect ease. A state deliberately designed to protect against corruption and petty politics, or a distant space isolated from the adulterating effects of a flawed contemporary society. The framework, as Aaron shows, supports Greek and Roman colonizing initiatives. For example, Hippodamus of Miletus's philosopher's colony at 𝘬𝘰𝘭𝘥, where settlers would have purposefully established a society insulated from the social and political demands of contemporary civilization. Moreover, the Roman general Sertorius, who fought on the wrong side of civil war against Sulla, also considered establishing his own utopia in the distant Isles of the Blessed, and then, more practically, aimed to refound Rome in Spain, a functioning state to stand in for the dystopic civil war politics in the capital city. Spain was also a fertile land, providing Rome with garum, olives, and mineral wealth, and Rome's interest in the area, whatever Sertorius's true motives may have been, speaks to the balance between a perfect life in paradise and the potential for economic exploitation at the hands of greedy speculators, a scenario played out in European colonizing initiatives across the globe, including Gregor MacGregor's Con in Central America. We also note that Jules Verne's Captain Nemo took to the underwater realm to escape human civilization after political upheaval in his homeland. Ryan Denson shows that utopia is a shifting canvas, best suited to exotic spaces that are inherently alien to normal human experience, whatever that might be. For example, Sir Thomas More placed his utopia in the Americas, unknown and replete with imaginative possibilities that are no longer relevant in the 21st century. The depths of the sea provide the most distant, inherently foreign space, separated from the normal world along both a horizontal and vertical axis, and representing an area that is all but shut off to most humans owing to a lack of appropriate technology or attributes. Most people simply cannot travel to the bottom of the sea. In antiquity, only the divine and semi-divine could approach Poseidon's underwater palace, the Nereids, Tritons, and Poseidon's son Theseus. And, according to an apocryphal legend, Alexander the Great descended in a spherical glass submarine to discover what was on the seabed. Such an anecdote enhances Alexander's mystique as someone who could encroach into a place closed to terrestrial folk, a place of extreme danger, where ordinary humans cannot exist. The sea remains the exclusive utopic domain of divinities in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, riffed by Disney, Madeline Miller's 𝘧𝘰, James Wan's 2018 Aquaman, where dissent and prejudice threaten to disrupt the watery kingdom. I also cannot resist mentioning Ringo Starr's Octopus's Garden, where, and I quote, "We are warm and safe from storms in our little hideaway beneath the waves. If the Beatles don't qualify as divine, no one does." In contemporary literature, the deep sea remains a modern utopic realm, but now opened up to those who possess superior semi-divine technology, whereby they carve out elaborate underwater cities that are protected from the watery elements by domes. Such treatments of the utopic watery deep also speak to human aspirations to extend human potential, shifting the canvas away from spaces infected by reality to deep space, humankind's final frontier, a starry analog to the watery depths. I argued that visions of utopia explore contemporary social and political tensions, population overgrowth, stresses to secure new resources, fear of strange lands, or the fear that what we do to them might happen to us. Settlement could be a violent act, often result in the extermination or expulsion of indigenous peoples. The original inhabitants of Corcyra were expelled by Corinthian invaders. Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and English explorers left a wake of destruction and annihilation in their efforts to, quote unquote, civilize the other throughout the world. In the Argonautica, we see just a hint of conflict between immigrants and natives when the Phaeacian founder of Scheria, Hylos, was killed by Istrian tribesmen. Apollonius's Phaeacians were forged in the wake of Alexander's expeditions, a time of political and social change, where dynastic loyalties guided international diplomacy. Patronized by the Ptolemies, Apollonius may have adjusted a tradition that associated the Phaeacians with Corcyra from as early as the 6th century BC to forefront desirable royal qualities. The Phaeacians present the only positive example of kingship in the Argonautica. Unlike the Homeric Phaeacians, the Apollonian Phaeacians were broadly involved in Hellenic diplomacy, and Alcinous's diplomatic dealings with Aeetes thus invites comparison with the Ptolemies, according to Duffy 2017. Anxiety, especially regarding international relations, lurks beneath the patina of paradise. Hamish Williams takes us to the future to query the past, investigating how modern writers engage with Minoan Crete, which remains an exotic, little understood piece of Mediterranean history, with its unusual linear B dialect, mysterious technology that was completely lost after the demise of Minoan society, and compellingly evocative artwork that features dancing maidens, dolphins, and bull leapers. This is a canvas upon which modern writers, Nikos Kazantzakis, Henry Miller, Lawrence Durrell, and others have constructed their own experiences of the Minoan sublime, just like English Romantic writers had crafted their own ancient utopias. Lord Byron, for example, was drawn to the romantic image of a derelict landscape cluttered with architecture in a state of deep disrepair. Percy Bysshe Shelley considered 5th century Athens a cultural golden age. Of no other epoch in the history of our species, he wrote, have we records and fragments stamped so visibly with the image of divinity in man. Ruins, like edges, like distant places, allow space for the imagination to design a place in a society according to contemporary ideals, such as Byron's enthusiasm for the ideological imperative of Hellenic patriotism. Minoan Crete is yet more distant in time, and the classical era is better understood now than it was to Byron. The temporal canvas has thus shifted back in time towards Utopia Minoica, whose setting invites a backstory, just as the distant future provokes utopias and dystopias. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, and Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, set in the 23rd century, just to mention a few obvious examples among many. In sum, each of our papers emphasize the remoteness of utopia or dystopia in space and time, a remoteness that writers and dreamers require in order to tackle contemporary stresses, changes, and fears indirectly and thus safely. Utopia is not necessarily a nostalgic longing for a mythical past that never existed, but a timely mechanism to interrogate contemporary questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgia. And I think that's an excellent place to finish off today. So I hope our listeners have enjoyed this hopefully quite novel idea of exploring utopias in the ancient world and their reception in the early modern and recent modern period, right? So thanks again to Georgia as discussant and panelist, and to both Aaron and Ryan for their great thoughts. And I will now press the end record button.